The board chose members to produce each segment of this event. And although our community is rich in healing story practitioners, we had to look no farther than Lani Peterson to find the perfect producer for this event. Lani is a storyteller, psychologist, and story practitioner. She began exploring applied storytelling more than 20 years ago when she began working with citizens returning from incarceration in City Mission, Boston. Her healing story work continued to expand and grow until she was working with homeless, youth at risk, and anyone whose voice was not heard and thereby kept them held back from being their fullest selves. She has worked with professionals in the medical, mental health, and spiritual fields, which is exactly what led her to put together this panel today. Lani now teaches storytelling and healing through the lifespan at Lesley University in their Master's Expressive Arts program. Her ongoing mission is to bring stories to light for everyone who is not heard and for those who need to hear those stories. I would add that Lani has achieved a state of playful serenity that is to be envied by all. So ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to introduce the producer and moderator of this panel, Lani Peterson.
Thank you, Linda. That was a wonderful and generous introduction. I also just want to begin by thanking Nest for having the foresight to bring together something like this, and to the Healing Story Alliance, which has been supporting me and my work and the work of anyone who's interested in healing story and applied healing story. And I highly encourage you to check out healingstory.org if you don't know of it already. And also thank you to Jim for supporting us and making this possible. And his work is incredible. And I highly encourage you to go to Transformational Storytelling to check out the remarkable things he's doing. When Linda reached out and asked me if I'd be interested in pulling together this panel, it was like Christmas. I immediately sat and thought back through my own history of people I have learned from, have been inspired by, who are mentors to me in the field of applied healing story, who are practitioners doing the work. And I particularly wanted to focus on people who are entering it through different fields. So those who were focused more on the bodies, on the mind, on the heart, on the spirit, certainly recognizing the overlap between all of those things. And I think we're going to hear a lot about that today. So although my 5 panelists may sound like they're coming from disparate directions, they have story and healing in common. And I'm excited for the discussion that will ensue of how they bring those things together. So here's how today is going to work. I've asked each of my 5 panelists to give about a 5 to 6 minute introduction of themselves. So the first half hour, we're going to be hearing a little bit from each of them about what's the nature and the focus of their work, the kinds of patients or clients or audiences that they work with, how they discovered story, and how they've been integrating healing story into their work. So I'm very excited to introduce you to these people who have been instrumental in my own learning and work, and hope that you also are inspired by them. So at the end, I just want to say that there will be time for questions and answers and to come into this discussion. So please use the chat. Cooper and Linda and I will be cruising through there often to pull out your ideas. And if you have someone in particular that you want to direct your question to, let us know so that we can alert them that this question is coming. So I want to begin with Richard Stone, because Richard actually was one of my first introductions to healing story. I was just learning about storytelling in the mid-90s and excited to learn the art of storytelling. But with my background in psychology, I became aware of healing story as a thing. I had never heard of it before. So I started to go to libraries and bookstores back in the day before internet was big to see what I could track down. And I came across Richard Stone's book, The Healing Art of Storytelling. This was back in 1997. And all of a sudden my world burst open and I thought, this is what I want to do. This is what I want to pursue. And it changed the whole course of my life. No pressure, Richard. So let me tell you a little bit about him. Richard's the CEO of Storywork International. I actually used that original text now in my teaching at Lesley. It's although back to 1997, there's still those ideas that are in there, I believe are current and applicable and need to be explored by all of us. But he's gone on to write several more books, Stories, The Family Legacy, The Kingdom of Nout, and with a co-author, The Patient Survival Handbook. He has been the co-chair of PCI Media Impact, which is an international organization located in New York City, committed to improving health, environmental, and social justice outcomes around the world using the power of story. In 2015, Richard was given the Patient Voice Impact Award, and his video that he created out of that describes his experience of caring for his ailing father. So I encourage you to try and track that down. When I reached out to Richard to see if he'd be willing to be part of this panel, I was so delighted when he jumped. And then I said, but you really are working in businesses now. I think about it, this is applied healing story. Are you still there? And he said, I'm still there. It's all about healing. It's all about the spirit and how we hold ourselves and each other. And I said, you're in. So it was with great pleasure. I want to bring to you now Richard Stone. Oh, you're on mute, Richard.
Me unmute myself. Good, thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here. And so you're the ones responsible for me getting a $24.82 royalty check every quarter for the sale of the book. I was wondering, where is that coming from? So Lani asked me to share a few things about what I'm doing now and a little bit about my journey. I've actually been working on a new book called Story Intelligence, which is kind of a compilation of really the 30 plus years I've been working with story. And not surprisingly, two of the chapters, I look at the 7 powers of story and these dimensions of story in our lives. And two of the chapters, one is the power of story to create meaning, and the other is the power of story to transform. So, which are obviously very relevant to today's topic. And so that work continues to inform my thinking profoundly. Through the years, I've had a chance to work with lots of healthcare organizations at a number of different levels. I've worked with leadership within healthcare organizations. Early on in my career, I think this is prior to writing The Healing Art of Storytelling, when I was actually thinking of doing workshops for families. And I met a hospice chaplain. And the hospice chaplain was very generous with me, and I offered to come in and do a program with him. But one of the things he did is he introduced me to another hospice chaplain. And talking with him about healing and story, he told me a story that was, to me, very impactful and profound. He said that when someone is injured or there's a car accident, a person's brought in and they're in really deep trouble, physically. And then the family members, they were either there during the event or they came afterwards. He said, I'm often the first person to spend time with them. And they have to tell the story of what happened. But he said they don't tell it one time or 2 times or 3 times. If they're there in the hospital for days or weeks, they're telling the story over and over and over again. And so it was very clear to me, and hearing that, is there is some deep process that our psyches have built in for the healing of traumatic events, and we story them, and that's the way we heal. So and I had a firsthand experience with that soon after, not too long after that. My wife's first husband, at a very young age, got cancer and died within months. And I was actually teaching overseas and came back, and I found myself on the side of just listening to the story over and over again. And I think what happens is often we listeners think it's about information, when in fact, it's really about healing. and we have to have the patience often to hear the story over and over again. More recently, I've been working with a healthcare system in North Carolina, Novant Health. And along the way in my journeys back, when I was very involved with the International Storytelling Center in Jonesboro, we had a healthcare and story conference, which I brought together. And I brought a couple of psychologists there who've been doing a lot of work with reminiscence. And Brewster and Al Belge, and they wrote a lovely little monograph called Listening to Life Stories, which I really recommend. And they were looking at how to use story within a healthcare setting to help patients. And that stuck with me. And I often, if I gave talks to healthcare leaders, I say, if you want to really improve the patient experience, train your volunteers to listen to your patients, just to come in and hear their stories, and it will have a huge impact. And so serendipitously, that opportunity came together at Novant Health, and over a period of years, we actually replicated the research, and then created a program called Living Stories, in which we were training volunteers to listen to patients. And we're focused on two kinds of stories. One is just what I would call simple reminiscence, but the positive memories. And the other was what I would call instrumental reminiscence, which is focused on stories where you face challenges and were able to overcome them. And the research is pretty clear that when patients are given the space to do that, their anxiety goes down, their resilience goes up. So that's been the more recent work with it. And then today I've been working around a thing called the Master Story Experience, which is really about helping people develop a deep sense of calling and purpose. And I think that when we have a deep sense of calling and purpose, that we become more resilient, have more capability to ride the waves of change, which are part of life. And that's been very rewarding to see the transformation that can happen for people when they come to a focus and realize that when their life is informed by deep purpose, it takes on greater meaning and really is much more fulfilling. And then lastly, power story in action. One of the things that happened along the way lately in the last couple of years, which have been included in the new book, is a couple whose son was injured in a football game in 10th grade and died from a head injury. And as you can imagine how traumatic that was and challenging. And one of the things that she told me at some point, as they were going through their grief process, she finally woke up one morning and said the question why was not being very helpful anymore. And what emerged in her mind was what now, which actually transformed their capacity to take a very difficult and painful experience and do some remarkable things to prevent brain injury for children who are involved in sports in North Carolina, but actually around the country. And the other thing which Lani mentioned is PCI Media that I'm still on the board with. And they learned very early on about the power of story to change minds and change behavior. And they use a thing called edutainment, which is a thing called the Psy.D method, which is a producer out of Mexico City who developed this whole methodology based on a TV show that played for years called Simplemente Maria in South America. And because of this show, 30,000 women went and signed up for literacy classes, and it transformed their lives. And he went, what happened here? How is it that possible that a story could do that? So I'm still just deeply involved with them and just believe in their work. And I think this is what we need to transform the world. So I'll stop there and we'll go on.
Thank you, Richard. Already I'm taking notes even from the introductions, and that move from the why to what now, from trying so desperately to make meaning and to finding purpose through action and transforming one's story in that way. I'm just moved by your work. So just get ready here to introduce our next panelist, Annie Brewster. Who actually, her name first came to me when I was doing work similar to what Richard was just describing. I was at UMass Medical Center, where they were just beginning to understand the power of story to reach patient groups that were diverse, who were not responding to treatment, and how to do outreach using storytelling to engage them both to come in for treatment as well as to continue the treatment that was prescribed. So Annie Brewster's name came up as somebody who was working in this area of capturing patient stories and understanding them. So Annie, for those of you who have read the bio provided, has her own story to tell. She is a doctor, internist, affiliated with Mass General Hospital, but also a patient who has been struggling herself with multiple sclerosis. In 2010, motivated by her belief in the power of stories to improve health, she started recording patients' narratives. And over the years, these stories have been featured in on NPR, WBUR, and she continually began to see and realize firsthand how the process of storytelling itself is therapeutic, both for the storyteller as well as for the listeners. In 2013, out of this work, she created the nonprofit organization, the Health Story Collaborative, which I encourage you to go and look into the work that they continue to do. You can also watch her TED Talk, Harnessing the Healing Power of Stories, where she shares her own story about the dual roles of both patient and doctor and what she's learned about the healing power of stories from both perspectives. In 2014, my youngest daughter was interested in the relationship between story and public health interventions. And I mentioned Annie's name, and she reached out to her, and Annie immediately invited her over to her living room to have a conversation about story, and I tagged along. Was such a gift. Their passion and commitment for this applied healing story work is so palpable. And I'm so delighted that she agreed today to be part of this panel. So Annie Brewster, please tell us a little bit more about yourself and your work.
Thank you so much, Lani. And thank you to Nest for having us, and to Rick for sharing your piece. That was really interesting. And I'm really excited to hear from the rest of the panelists. So as Lani said, I'm a patient and a doctor. Health Story Collaborative is based in Cambridge, Massachusetts, a small grassroots organization. And we're really dedicated to collecting and honoring and sharing stories of illness and healing. And we do that to empower patients primarily and to make individuals navigating health challenges feel less alone, but also the ripple effect of helping family members and having listeners to those stories feel less alone as well. We define illness and healing very broadly. So illness is sort of any imbalance in physical, psychological, or spiritual well-being, and healing is sort of moving back towards balance and wholeness. We work within healthcare, but actually I felt I had to step outside of my role as an academic physician to get Health Story off the ground, because there's a lot of risk management within the healthcare system, as you can imagine. I came to this feeling the need for the stories through my personal experience, both sort of on parallel tracks of what was broken in the healthcare system. So sort of learning that as a physician. I was in primary care when I first came out of residency, and found it very challenging in that, you know, we have 15-minute appointments. It's very rushed. It's very time pressured. It's about efficiency, and it felt more like a business than it did really about connection, which is why I had gone into the field, as most doctors do. And I was feeling sad about that and wanting to address that somehow. And then at the same time, in 2001, when I was in my end of my training, I myself was diagnosed with MS. And that was pivotal for me in sort of understanding from the patient side what was broken in healthcare, and feeling like I wasn't being seen, heard, listened to in full. And I say also that what was really transformative for me is learning that as a patient, when you get a diagnosis, it can really be identity. It can change your identity in a very big way. And I'd never really appreciated this as a doctor. Sometimes as a doctor, we're sort of get to the diagnosis, deliver it, and then think the story's over, whereas the story is really just beginning for the patient. And I had not really understood that to be true. But when I had to navigate it myself, I realized how much it challenged my identity and sort of forced me to rewrite my own story. And I'd say that story really helped me to integrate that new diagnosis into my life. And so we're really committed in that way to helping people integrate challenging experiences through their stories. I started just out of intuition and sort of my own clinical experience of knowing that as a doctor, the best thing I can do is really be present for my patients and listen. And for me, understanding the power of when I finally felt comfortable sharing my story, how validating that was, and how sort of stepping into myself fully and being witnessed in doing so was incredibly healing. But one very important development for me was meeting my research colleague, Jonathan Adler, who is the Chief Academic Officer of Health Story Collaborative. And he adds a scientific bent to this. And at first I sort of balked at science and thought, not everything of value can be measured. This felt more sacred to me. But in fact, his research is really grounded in story and personal experience. He studies the health benefit of narrative. Really, his focus is on the mental health benefits of narrative based on this concept called narrative identity, that sort of who we are is based on the stories we tell, which I'm sure everyone who's here listening to this knows that to be true. And that I think for me, the most empowering thing was to realize that as he would say, we're not only the main characters in our stories, but we're also the narrator in our stories. So we can decide ourselves how to tell them, and they can continue to evolve over time and change. And that, even though we can't control the things that are happening to us, sometimes we can control how we make sense of those things and how we make meaning reflected in the stories we tell. So his work also looks at sort of what makes for a psychologically beneficial story when someone is telling a story. And it turns out it's not so much about the content, but more about the themes that show up in the stories that are very much associated with improvements in mental health. And those are themes like agency, communion, redemption, and something called accommodative processing, which is sort of about digging deep and finding meaning, which means going into the hard parts of the story and processing them and having to rewrite your story because of these challenges. That's good for us. And so we base a lot of our programming on this research, and also on the research that's out there on the benefits of listening to stories, of stories for community. And we have a lot of different programs that are really about creating intentional spaces within healthcare and just within outside of the healthcare institutions, but around illness and healing, for stories to be told, for people to have that opportunity to share and to be witnessed. And so we have live storytelling events that we do called healing story sessions. We have also a lot of online content of audio stories and written stories. And we also have a project that's called the Opioid Project, changing perceptions through art and storytelling. So using storytelling as a way to move the needle in terms of public health and social change. So to work with individuals who have lost someone to overdose, or who are in the middle of recovery, or are first responders, and giving them an opportunity to tell their stories. We do this in a context of making art with an artist colleague, and then share these multimedia pieces of art with an audio story and a collage that they've created to hopefully destigmatize addiction. And so I do believe in the transformative power of stories for social change, as well as for individual health and transformation. So I'll leave it there, and I'm really happy to be here. Thanks, everyone.
There's so much to come back to. Thank you, Annie. Your experience of being on both sides, and really we all are on both sides. I think of we all are stuck at moments in wounded stories that leave us feeling less than we are. And we've all been in that position, I believe, whether we're in the healing profession or not, but of being a healing presence for another. And so you're talking about the power and importance of that presence, that connection, to help one do that meaning-making work and move towards agency, is something that, whether we are in the healing professions or not, can learn from. So thank you. I would next like to introduce our third panelist, David Yoder. So David and I have actually never met, but we recently were connected through the Great Connector LinkedIn. when David reached out to me. He has an insatiable curiosity, and right now that curiosity is focused on story and the impact of story on healing. You might be surprised that David is a chiropractor, and so how did that end up on this panel? That's the very reason I chose him, is to expand our ideas of where healing story can emerge and show up. In our one brief conversation we had, much too short, and I look forward to many more, David, I found us covering this vast array of neuropsychology, heart math, EMDR, all as we were covering the common element of story and healing, and what healing, how it arises. You would see in his biography that David has begun through his chiropractic to realize that when he, within his sessions, opens up and leaves room for patients to tell their stories, that he sees vast differences in what is happening in that session and the healing that occurs. So bringing us a very different perspective, I invite David to tell us a little bit about himself and his own journey to discover story in his work. David?
Thank you, Lani, for inviting me to be on this panel. I feel humbled to be amongst great storytellers. I'm kind of new to this myself. And yes, so I'd like to segue right in with the concept of presence and how the power of creating presence for a client or patient can bring about healing potential. So my wife always asks me how my day was going, and I share with her the different stories and kind of things that happened during the day. And I'm now known as the doctor that makes people cry, not painful crying, but good crying, releasing their stories. And so recently, one of my current clients, she wanted to bring a friend from the Bay Area. I'm down here in San Diego. And she said, I know just what you do, Dr. Yoder, is so different that you can help my friend somehow. And so if this is not chiropractic, but if you could just see him, I would be very thankful. So as the patient walked in, his chief symptom was a very severe, painful rash on the both lower extremities of both legs. And it happened to occur about 6 months earlier. And so he had seen dermatologists and pain specialists, and they couldn't find out why the pain wasn't alleviating or why the rash was still persisting. So there wasn't anything obvious in my objective perspective of being a chiropractor that was linked. So I just asked him, what was going on in your life around the time that this rash started? And he got very silent and very quiet. His head kind of went down. And then he started to show a tear, and he says, well, that was the same month my son died. He actually committed suicide. And so my patient had, it was a hot summer in Sacramento, and they took care of properties. And apparently the son had committed suicide about a week earlier. And so when the father came into the apartment complex, the body had been decomposing. And so there were a lot of things in the atmosphere and bugs that also had bit his legs. And so he obviously was in shock and trauma and the beginnings of PTSD from discovering his dead son that committed suicide, but he got an infection from the bugs. And so I just went from there. I said, I'm very sorry to hear that you've lost your son. And I just put my hand on his shoulder, and he continued to cry. And I asked him if he had a chance to speak to a therapist or go to grief counseling. And he said no. I said, I would highly recommend that. And so just by giving him the space to share his story of what was going on prior or at the same time of his physical symptoms, I think it brought him to presence so that his body could shift into a healing state there. So everybody was diagnosing him and looking at the legs, but they weren't seeing him as the big person. So that's an example of how I provide an opportunity to my clients to be present and share their stories. I'm trained in a technique called NET, which is an abbreviation of neuro-emotional technique. It kind of comes from the Chinese perspective of meridians, where we have different organs that transmit symptoms to different body areas, but on the NET chart, it also talks about emotions that are also related to those physical areas. For example, the lung meridian is known to be triggered by the feelings of grief and sadness. So if I have a client that comes to me with chronic shoulder pain or chest pain or lung symptoms, I'm not just looking at the physical part, but the possibly emotions. And then if I sense and ask the patient, is there something going on? That just in itself provides the opportunity for them to open up and expand their story. Yes, I'm a very curious person, so I love learning and learning about story and giving my patients the opportunity to use the possibility to be curious about their own process. What I also love about story is that story is not a fixed past history. It's not stuck. It can be evolved and opened up. It can be recreated. So I like to share with my clients that the human body is remade every 5 to 7 years. Every cell is being rejuvenated. In fact, every cell but the lens of the eyes and half of the heart cells are entirely regenerated in a 7-year process. Even our skeletal frame is rejuvenated. So there's something very special about, I guess, the cells of the eyes that they stay the same. So the vision is very powerful for story. So we don't see data, we see images. So story is very visual. And if I have a moment here, I'd like to share a quick story about how the power of being presence and vision was impactful in my life. So when I was born, my birth mother was a little bit in a different place in her life. She was stressed and confused, and so I was adopted away. So I was in a foster home for about 3 or 4 months before I was adopted by my current family. And so I don't remember anything up until about 2 years of age, and I think I maybe have blocked that out. So I always asked my parents as much as I could about my background being adopted, why I was adopted, but it was all through their perspective. And so I knew one day that I was to be a father. I just could envision myself having a family and having a wife and having a son of my own. So come forward at my son's birth, when my wife was birthing him, we recorded it, and I would show my son the video of his birth. But then one day I asked him if he could remember from first point of view his birth, and he actually said, "Yes, Dad." And I was like, wow, he remembers his birth. That's pretty amazing. How many people actually remember the birth moment? So then I challenged him. I said, okay, Noah, what were you doing in mommy's belly? And he said, I was floating. That's a pretty good descriptive term to describe how a baby's in a mother's womb. And then I said, what color did you see? And he said, I saw the color of red and orange, the color of blood. So that's what he would see from first point of view. I'm like, wow, he's very accurate. Then I said, do you remember being born when mommy pushed you out? And he said, yes, I was very excited to see you and mommy. I could hear your voices. And when I came out and I opened my eyes, you guys were blurry. He doesn't know from biology or medical school that a newborn's vision is blurry for a few hours before it's formed later on. So from his recollection, he truly remembers his birth. As I unfortunately did not. I think there may have been some trauma, some stress around my birth. So that's the power of updating and changing the story, that my story was birth is, it can be stressful for the mom, it's something you don't really remember. It can be quite messy, but my son's story is he remembers it first point of view and actually has vivid present mindfulness to share that perspective. I think is just quite amazing. So that was a bit of a healing journey for me to know that my son remembered his birth, and all of us together as the family is just one of my most favorite memories of all time. I'd like to share a little bit of science. So they found out that story elicits the release of dopamine, oxytocin, and these are neurotransmitters that the brain uses for thinking, but the immune system also uses dopamine as a reward system to strengthen the immune system. So the white blood cells give the B cells dopamine kind of cookies to help them seek out and be curious about their environment, to be a strong, resilient immune system. So by being curious and using story, we actually feed the brain that then feeds the immune system. So I think that's quite fascinating that it's all linked together. And then lastly, I'd like to share a quote from C.S. Lewis regarding story. You can't go back and change the beginning, but you can start where you are and change the ending. So story is a great tool that brings together different data points in time and makes a theme that is held in our body. And whether you're an individual, you're just learning about story, you're a physical practitioner, you're a talk therapist, you're a doctor, I think we should all really be inspired from the members here and with Lani to learn and be curious about story for updating and changing your story. Thank you, Lani.
Thank you, David. Beautiful, beautiful. The whole notion of the mind-body connection, being connected through story, and that story begins perhaps long before we're born, is a powerful idea for us to perhaps explore a little bit more today. The fourth member of our panel is Ann Hallward, Dr. Ann Hallward, who I connected with, I was trying to remember, probably about 8 years ago when she invited me to speak on her Safe Space radio show about the work I was doing at the time with the incarcerated. She is the host and founder of Safe Space Radio, whose mission is to inspire courageous conversations and break down the barriers that divide us and create compassion, community, and story as at the heart of it. So how could we not have her here with us today? She's a board certified psychiatrist. She practices in Portland, Maine. She was formerly on the faculty at Harvard Medical School, where she designed and taught courses on death and dying, cultural competence, sexuality, and psychiatric interviewing. Ann speaks internationally on emotional courage, stigma and shame, and traumatic silence. She specializes in subjects that are hard to talk about. I encourage you to look at Dr. Ann Hallward's TED Talk, which is called How Telling Our Silence Stories Can Change the World. And she's here to share some of her wisdom and experience and insight with us today. So Dr. Ann Hallward.
Lani, thank you. I'm so honored to be part of this group of all of you, and even just listening to all of you as you were arriving. It's like, oh, there's such a community among storytellers. It's wonderful to be part of this. So I first really discovered the power of story. I work primarily as a therapist in my work as a psychiatrist in listening to stories. And what I found was that, this was maybe back in 2001 when I was first starting to practice, the stories that I was listening to, I suddenly started noticing that the heart of people's suffering was the same, no matter what they were coming to me for. And it was this sort of stunning realization. So someone was coming to me for depression. At the heart of that suffering was this feeling of weakness and failure and defectiveness. And I knew that we were getting there because the whole body language would change. The person would break eye contact, cover their face, look down, cover their mouth. And then if someone was coming to see me for addiction, it was the same story, a story finally at the heart of weakness, moral failure, again, defectiveness, badness. And I feel like if others really knew this, I would be unlovable. I have to hide it. Same thing was true for trauma. The heart of trauma. You know, we think of trauma as an anxiety disorder. We think of it as about terror and fear. And of course, that's all very true. But fundamentally, even deeper, the suffering is about shame, is about I'm damaged goods. How was this my fault? How is this my failure to stop it, my failure to prevent it, my failure to communicate my humanity to the perpetrator? Because if I had only been successful at that, they would never have kept going. So I didn't realize, until I really started doing this work, I didn't realize that the meaning of the story of trauma was often a meaning of failure to the person, and it was shameful. And if you knew it, you would not love me anymore. So I started thinking, like, shame is the public health emergency of, like, this is the thing, talk about meaning and purpose. I loved what you were saying about resilience and meaning and purpose, Richard. my meaning and purpose became like, I feel like I've stumbled upon this public health crisis that is at the heart of addiction, at the heart of suicide, at the heart of suffering, which is shame. And I have to think of a public health solution for it, because my patients were all, their stories were silenced. Their stories were hidden because of this fear, if they were revealed, that they would become unlovable. So I was like, how do I come up with a public health solution to this public health problem of shame? And it was interesting to hear you, David, talk about the eyes. So much of shame is about seeing my badness witness, having my badness feel visually exposed. So it occurred to me that radio was the perfect way to tell stories where the teller and the listener are not visually exposed. On radio, daytime TV, which is a lot of shameful stories, the person is like, look at their hair, look at their, their outfit, look at, like, are they holding their stomach in? It's just awful. It's all shaming. But radio, the guest you don't know about their outfit or their hair. It was just wonderful. But also, we listen to the radio alone. We listen to the radio in our car. We listen to the radio when we're doing chores or on the treadmill. It's very intimate. Those little earbuds, get right in, and nobody's observing us. So if I'm, listening to a story about sexual dysfunction, my family members don't have to know about it. So there's this intimacy about radio that I felt thrilled about. So I started radio in 2008. We were a regional show for 8 years, and now we've become a national show. We broadcast on NPR stations. Always with this idea of reducing shame, reducing stigma, and helping people tell a story that can help someone else. So the thing I want to tell us that I learned about the opposite of shame is really courage. And in discovering basically almost every single person I interview on the show, and now it's probably been 500 people, maybe more, when I say, well, what do you want? What's your meaning and purpose? Why do you want to tell this story? And fundamentally, the answer is almost always some version of the same answer, which is, I want to transform my suffering into a gift for others. I want to use what I have struggled with to lift someone else's pain. So I've learned that courage is generous. Courage is almost always about creating more safety for others to be able to step into. It's an act of generosity. So that is the spirit behind Safe Space Radio. And what we're doing now is we've created playlists for doctors' offices in OBGYN, pediatrics, family medicine. And we're in conversation right now with Johns Hopkins and Kaiser Permanente to have our podcast be a playlist, be in the virtual waiting room, because of course nobody's going into real waiting rooms these days, so that you can start listening to story while you're waiting for your doctor's appointment, which I'm really excited about. And we're also using stories and podcasts in the training of medical students, nursing students, and social workers, because the research shows that empathy goes down during these trainings. And we're using story as what I call it as an empathy expander among clinicians to keep our hearts soft and open. So Lani asked us to tell a quick story about the power of story. And I'll tell you one. My dad had early onset dementia, it's called frontotemporal dementia. It's a kind of dementia that hits you very young, and it changes not only your memory, but your language and your personality. And so he lived with this for 16 years, because the problem with this kind of dementia is you get it so young, your body is still healthy. I'm the only doctor in my family, so I was very involved in his care, and it was heart-wrenching. It was just devastating to feel so helpless to stop this inexorable progress of his decline. And I had many shameful feelings in the course of taking care of him, like finally, eventually just praying for him to die, wishing he could die sooner, because he was so vacant. His face was just completely vacant, and I could hardly bear it. And I felt terrible shame and guilt about my wish for my own dad to die, because I loved him so much. So I decided to make our first sort of national special. It was our second. It was about shameful aspects of becoming a caregiver, like the things that we hide, the things we don't want people to know about caregiving. And one of them is a story of a woman who almost hit her mother. And she really wanted to hit her. I mean, she was overwhelmed with helplessness. And she tells this incredibly honest story about coming so close to hitting her mother. Of course, we know that elder abuse is very, very common. And so it aired on the radio. And what I want to do now is share the response from a listener to the story. So this is a guy who was driving in his car. He was the caregiver. Both his parents got dementia. He cared for them alone. He had no siblings. And he was driving randomly in the car and listened to the show. And this is what he wanted to tell me about the power of story.
Basically flew alone and happened to hear this program on the radio. And I felt normal for the first time, that I wasn't overreacting, that I wasn't underreacting, that my feelings were legitimate, were normal. And that's made all the difference in going forward. It made going forward possible, really.
So just to close, I really learned that telling stories that reduce our shame and make us feel less alone is really life-saving.
Let's take a breath for a moment. Powerful. Thank you. Thank you, Annie. So you're talking about shame, and thinking about Annie Brewster talking earlier about the importance of being seen, and how you brought home for me that's not necessarily visual, and that sometimes not having that visual distraction allows someone to be seen in a whole different way through that audio story that one can take in. It allows one to speak it and others to hear it without the distractions of the visual. So just holding seeing at multiple levels, and the power of, as your speaker said, having one's experience normalized through seeing themselves in another. We have one more panelist to introduce, Juliet Bruce, who many of you who are members of HSA Healing Story Alliance will know that name. She's been an old and long friend of the Healing Story Alliance, and I can't remember the first time we met or how long ago it's been that long. But Juliet is a psychologist and a healing story practitioner who practices in New York City, and she uses ancient myths, the hero's journey, improvisational writing, many story tools to work with individuals, families, and communities to help them find their way out of trauma, out of crisis, to a more purposeful existence through transforming their stories. She, very excited, she's completing a combination memoir and workbook called A Rite of Passage, and Rite is W-R-I-T-E, about healing story for a new world. So I hope we'll learn when we might be able to expect that. But this book is bringing together her more than 26 years of experience of healing story and the work that she's done. For those of you, again, who are in the storytelling world and the National Storytelling Network, you'll be familiar with the Brimstone Award. Juliet won that in 2007 when she was creating a program to address the needs of the New York City firefighters who were suffering from PTSD after 9/11. So very powerful work. So delighted to have you with us on this panel, Juliet. Please tell us more about yourself. You're still on mute.
Hi. That's why. Thank you, Lani. This is so rich. I'm just finding myself so fascinated and filled with your all's experience and stories. I call myself a story facilitator because I don't think of myself as a performer of stories. I'm a writer, primarily a writer, and I facilitate people's discovering the deep stories that are taking place in their lives as they're going through difficult change. So stories, particularly mythic stories, fairy tales, stories of adventure and return, are metaphorical journeys of change. And this is the paradigm that I work in to help people go through their own journeys of change in in their present lives, and to find the really deep mythic resonances that are taking place in their lives as guideposts for what they're going through. So as Lani said, I started doing this 27 years ago, really, in 1994. I was a journalist and I was unhappy. And I entered a poetry therapy training program at a local hospital in DC, where I was then living. And I chose as my internship site a maximum security unit for mentally ill prisoners, what used to be known as criminally insane. So I started with poetry as the training regimen required. And the men were just not really engaged. They were playing along, kind of playing the old game. And just on impulse, I should say that I had written my way through depression several years before by just writing my way through the myths, through several myths. So so I knew the power of myth in really galvanizing life force in people where it's become weak. So on this impulse, I just said, let me tell you a story. And I told them the end of the Odyssey. When Odysseus, after 20 years of being lost at war and then at sea, is shipwrecked on a beach on an island. And some men find him and carry him to the court of the king, where he begins to tell his stories of his wanderings, which is what the Odyssey is. And the king and the court are so moved by this man's suffering and his courage and his resilience that they decide they're a seafaring people. They're going to take him home to Ithaca. So I told these men that story, and that just changed the ballgame. What these men wanted more than anything, some of them had been in maximum security for 30 years. One man had not been outside in 5 years. What did they want from me? Help me get home, Miss Bruce. Help me get home. And really, I found that people going through change, whatever kind of change it is, want to get home. Healing stories always end with some kind of homecoming. So I told them the end of the Odyssey, and then began to, rather than following the poetry and bibliotherapy regimen, I just had them write whatever they wanted to write, and then share if they wanted to. And in this process, these men who had been identified and defined by a European, all of these men in that group were African American. So they had been given identities by their therapists, by their jailers, based on a European norm, which had nothing really to do with their lives, with their culture and their real needs. So in this process of releasing them into story, into being the narrators of their own stories, they transformed from schizophrenic, killer, kidnapper, drug addict into seeker and adventurer storyteller. So I was there for almost a year with these men in this group. And in that time, and the other thing that was very striking to me is, as the men would tell their stories, right, and then tell their stories with, and I should say this, my mantra was, out beyond doing right and doing wrong is a field of luminous consciousness. I'll meet you there. So that I never diagnosed, I never judged them. It was story. We were sharing stories. And I sometimes shared my own when it was relevant and I thought it would be helpful. In the process of this year, of these men just simply gathering together and being in a different kind of community, not of criminals, but of seekers and heroes and warriors trying to come home, they put out a newsletter every month. They wrote a play. They gave a public reading. And most incredibly of all, their symptoms decreased so dramatically that 16 out of 20 men were transferred out of maximum security. You know, a good story is an honest story. And what happened after that was lacking the kinds of external support systems that they really needed. They all ended up back in max. The old story, Sisyphus returns to max. But in that year, I learned from them how to really do this work. And it was to share a wisdom tale or even a poem, and then let them engage directly with that piece of telling. And I would just more or less hold space. And, you know, story pulls story. They healed each other. They helped each other come home within the safe container of these stories and poems that I would tell as kind of launch pads to their hearts. And I learned from them how to do this work. And I have, in the last 27 years, I've worked with every possible kind of population going through traumatic change, cancer survivors, homeless people, street teens with AIDS, and now during the pandemic, just people isolated in their apartments, in their houses, alone and scared. And it's always the same. When I'm working in community, in a group of people, very small groups, like 6 people, 7 people, 8 people, they resonate so deeply with each other's improvisational writings that they create this deep spiritual community, resonant community that is, along with the story, I think the most important element in holding them steady and focused on what their intention is for their lives, their vision of what healing means in their lives. What else do I want to tell you? I let the groups, I trust group impulse, so I let the groups guide me. I try to really become invisible, which is very natural for me anyway. I think of myself as I've always in my life been a listener rather than a teller. So I can listen and kind of hear the subtext, the story that's going on beneath the surface, and I feed that back a little bit, but I don't take the position of therapist, because I want to keep this in this indigenous, inspired, ancient storytelling circle. Sometimes when I'm working in person with people, I'll have them make a story fire out of construction paper, and then like just write a little note on the flame that they're adding to the fire. I'm trained in expressive arts, so I will use anything that's authentically expressive to help them express their stories. And the main thing that I see is that when we can express our story, whatever it is, and ourselves, whatever we have inside of us, we become whole. And wholeness is coming home. So I'm willing and happy to answer any questions that you have. And I'm just delighted to be here. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Juliet. We have a lot to chew on here. And again, I invite every listener out there, as you've been stirred with questions, please begin to put them into the chat so that we can bring you into this conversation with us. As I was listening to each of the 5 of you, I was myself on a journey of thinking, is this work? What is it? And the themes that I was hearing recurring is around what makes a story a wounded story that needs transformation or healing. And some of the themes I heard underneath that were shame, unlovable, disconnected to self, to other, loss of meaning and purpose, agency. I think of this idea of a wounded story, and this comes out of the narrative therapy realm, as being a thin story, a story that we have about ourselves or about other that isn't thick enough to hold the possibilities for ourselves of who we are and what we can be. and that the work perhaps is how to enter that thin story and not change the course of that story, but to expand it. So we don't remove it because it's there, but how do we expand that thick story into that thin story into something thicker that can hold more of us? So if we think of the wounded story and the goal is healing, what does that look like? And the themes, the flip side of that, that I heard many of you speak to in different ways, is a return to balance, a wholeness, a move from unlovable to feeling lovable, capable of love, our ability to step into our agency, our courage to find meaning, to find purpose. So then it comes down to what beautiful goals. So what's the path, and how do we do that? And now we're getting down to sort of healing story and the work of healing story of sometimes we are a healing listener and sometimes we're a healing teller. And how do we know when to step in with which, and what does that look like? So I had asked before this from our panelists to come up with questions that they'd enjoy hearing each other speak about. And one of the first ones that came out of the group was, how do you create a safe and encouraging holding for someone to feel safe enough to share their most challenging or important story? What does that look like or feel like? And I think Cooper is going to bring all of us up here, and if any one of you would like to begin with that. Actually, the question came originally from Anne, and I don't know if she had thoughts about it or if she actually wanted to hear other people speak about it first.
I'll jump in. This is Annie. I think for me, it's about just creating an intentional space and opening that up. But most importantly, I think making the person who's telling their story feel like they're in charge and that it's their story to tell in whatever way they want to tell it, and whatever is going to be done with it is up to them. And I've worked with the media over the years a fair amount, and I found that there's sometimes this tension there when the media sort of might want me to create the most dramatic story or the sound bites, and the person whose story it is might not want that part included, or might decide at the end of our interview that they don't want to share it at all. So I always, when I'm working with people, have them sign a waiver, but I always tell them that if they decide at the end of our session that they don't want us to use the story in any way, then I will tear that up, and I will honor that always, because I think the most important thing is that they know that it's up to them what happens to that story and that they're ultimately in charge.
So even though the beginning contract is to come to share your story, that others might hear it, the process of their own hearing, listening, sharing their story is the healing focus. And if that's where it needs to stop, that's where. Juliet, did I hear you want to speak?
No, but I will. So in my experience, I found that people are longing to tell their stories and they don't know how. So when we tell a myth, a fairy tale, crisis, struggle, transformation, we're giving them a paradigm to begin to organize their thinking or just their talking within. We're giving them very visceral images to build off of. And I find that people really are longing to share their stories with everybody. So I'm very careful, having made some mistakes early on in my career doing this work. I thought everybody would just want to share their stories and didn't. In fact, it was in my book. I put a story in my book that I thought was the end of the book, about a woman crossing the threshold to love. A woman who had been seeing a man for a long time, and she was very afraid. We worked on a poem, and in that poem, she found one line that gave her a purpose for being in this new relationship. And it just changed everything for her. And she was ready to cross the threshold to commit to this man. And it was one of the most beautiful experiences I'd had. And I told her that I was going to include it, but I hadn't asked her for her permission before that. And she was very raw at that time. Her husband had just died. This man that she later married had just died. And so I have learned to be very, very cautious about what I share and how I share stories once the groups are over. And that's a challenge in writing a book about this work, but that I'm just very sensitive to that now.
There's a question from Laura Sims that I think could build on this, Juliet. You said you heard people are always longing to share their story. And her question is, what constitutes a story? And if someone's just essentially sharing a litany of events, is that the same thing? Is that?
No, that's what's so, I'm sorry.
No,
That's what's so beautiful. I get so excited about this. You know, Laura, hi. I get so excited about the hero's journey and creation tales and the adventure and return plot. It's all there set up for us to tell a story. So what's so beautiful about setting the stage or creating a container with the hero's journey story is that it's not a victim story, it's a creator story. It's a creator story because every step of the way, the protagonist of this story has choice in attitude, choice in action. So it's setting up a paradigm for being a hero of your story, of your adventure, of your life experience as a way of mastering it, rather than telling over and over the victim tale, which just sends you back to what your parents did to you, what happened to you. This is about what can I make of this now? It's the basic artist question. Not so much why, but what can I make with this? So I feel that's sort of how I proceed with the story. And I hope that touches on a little bit, Laura, what you were asking.
And for those of you who are not approaching it from a more therapist point of view, but within your other healing modalities, how would you address that question? What makes the story? Is it important that it be in story arc mode?
David, you were raising your hand, David.
So I want to go backwards before this question to share a tool that I use in my office. So kind of back to using the eyes as a tool to see where a person is at. So when our eyes look left, that's past recollection. When our eyes look right, that's future imagination, creation. And so ideally we want to be present where we're looking forward, neither left or right, we're present. So the trick that I do or tool is I say to the client, well, what is the old story? So share like what the old story was. And so I say, for example, the old story of David was, I used to feel, that everybody judged me and that what they had to say was more important than what I had to say. And I had to look to the left. And then I say, okay, looking to the right, what is the new story that you would like to create? And so they find it difficult to do that. But when they look to the right and say, okay, well, the new story is, I want to be confident. I want to feel less judged by what others think of me and just trust my intuition. It gets things flowing, gets things more present. So it's a little trick that I do, have the client share the old story of me was, and then the new story of me is.
Yeah, it's sort of related to that. The research of narrative identity sort of is that the identity that we shape in our lives is sort of these high point, low point, turning point moments that sort of are the scaffolding of that identity. So when we're helping people think through their stories, we're usually focusing in on those big moments, those transformational moments, those turning points. And so usually there is sort of, I'm getting back to like, is it a story arc kind of thing? Usually we do sort of look for the beginning or the before, and then what was that turning point moment, and then the after. So there is some movement and transformation through that, I'd say.
I'd add one little thing here. It's something that I've been working and playing with is the notion that we tend in the telling of our story is to draw a conclusion. and a victim story has a conclusion, and therefore, I've been working both in myself and in my thinking and writing is that how do we live without a conclusion, with a story that doesn't have a meaning? Is that we have the events of our life and then we append a meaning to them. And what does it mean not to live outside of the meaning, but to live just in the present of them, to be present to the things that are happening? And I think when we can do that, it frees us to create a new possibility. Because what happens is, I think that the reason stories are so wounding is that that we append a meaning to them, to the meaning of those events in the past. And when we can allow ourselves to begin to see our life as an open possibility, the past no longer has a hold on the present and the future. Something I've just been thinking about a lot.
Anne?
I've been really thinking a lot about what it is that helps people access their courage. I said earlier that I think courage and generosity are very connected. And so for me, people come to tell their story on the radio because they have a gift they want to give. And usually, coming back to Laura's question, it's because there has been some kind of profound struggle with shame and there's some emergence from it. That emergence can take all kinds of forms, but I screen everyone before I do an interview, before I record, to make sure that they really are ready and are not going to feel overwhelmingly exposed and ashamed after recording it. But I have found that when people are motivated by generosity, that there's a certain safety that generates. Interestingly, there was one other thing I want to say, and it's completely escaped me. Oh, yes. So I've started asking people about experiences where they've been able to access their courage when it comes to telling a difficult story. And when people can access their what they love, who they love that they want to tell this story to, that also helps people tell their most courageous story when they're telling it to an intended audience that either they love or they feel loved by.
I think about how Annie Brewster was talking in the beginning about really the illness story is one of where one is feeling disconnected, and that already, and you're talking about having somebody find the courage through connecting in their mind to an idea of someone they want to tell it to, is the beginning of reconnecting them to what's important within them. There's work done on resilience, and that word has also come up here. And my understanding is that there's 4 parts to it, and I'm going to raise the 4 because we've talked about all of them, and see if any of you want to connect the dots to the work you do in story. But the 4 parts around resilience are, the first is I am connected, that if I feel connected to myself and others, that's the beginning of wholeness. That I feel competent or capable to do what I need to do. And I think of that as agency that Richard was talking about, that I count, that I matter, that I have a purpose and a meaning of why I'm here. And the last is courage, that I have the courage to move forward in my connections, my competencies, and my purpose, so that I have that agency to do what I'm meant to do. So is there any way that you see that how story in your work connects to the sense of resilience?
Well, here in Atlanta, where I am, there are a couple of psychologists at Emory, Marshall Duke and Robin Feibush, who've been studying this and looking at family storytelling. And they sort of serendipitously happened upon an insight as they were looking at how stories are shared within families, is that children who hear stories robustly within their family have higher, it's actually the best predictor of children having high resilience and high self-esteem, which I thought was just fascinating. And I think if you understand that a child doesn't have they're born into a story that's already going on. They don't have a story yet, and they're beginning to develop a reservoir of stories that perhaps can see them through difficulty. And so having stories from their parents about challenges that they have gone through can in fact become a touchstone for them when they face challenges. They can then draw upon, well, mom and dad went through this. I guess I can get through that. And I think that what's missing today, and probably for most of you this will resonate, is that children don't have those stories. And we think of teen suicide and the prevalence of that. And there's not, within my family, part of my family constellation, a cousin's daughter committed suicide, and I was wondering, why is this so prevalent? And I think part of it is the kids don't have that body of stories to fall back on, and so when they do get into difficulty, they have no story that can carry them through the difficult waters.
What do you mean when you say that? I don't really understand yet. Why do children not have those stories?
Because they're not hearing them from their parents. So if you grow up in a household where there is not a lot of sharing of stories, and I think that is a more prevalent condition today than it was maybe when you and I were growing up. People are not sitting around the fire telling stories. Parents are not sharing their life experiences as robustly, I think, as they used to. So children don't have that. They don't have that touchstone. They don't have those stories to draw upon. That help, Annie?
I mean, that totally interests me because as a psychiatrist, I'm assessing for suicide all the time. So that question of did you hear stories of people overcoming adversity when you were growing up is one I have never used as part of my suicide assessment.
They have a wonderful little questionnaire called Do You Know? It's 20 questions, and they found the answer to those 20 questions was the higher the score, the more resilience and self-esteem that the child had.
You send me to it? I'd love to see.
I can. I can stick it in
the link in chat.
I got it on my website. Let me get the link and I'll stick it in the chat.
Thank you.
Great. So some more questions coming in from the audience. This one's from Kristen Permonti. She said, an aspect I love of narrative therapy is the multi-layered story, that each of us are so many layers, not just one descriptor. I'm thinking back again to story as identity that Annie, we were talking about, and Richard, the story narrative reminiscence that's coming out here too. So how can that open up a preferred story and a broader view of ourself and others, in that we are all multi-layered? How can this change our interactions? Anyone want to take that on? That multi-layered.
I can share a quick situation from my son. So I heard from Vedic literature the aspects of the seer, the seen, and the seeing. So there's three perspectives at all times. A little bit tricky, so I'll say it again: the seer, the seen, and the seeing. So as a doctor, when I look at my patient, I'm the seer, the patient is the seen, and then you guys, the audience, would be the seeing. So we need to have story, ideally, from all three perspectives, kind of like the story of the teacher with the students around the elephant, and everyone's holding a different part of the elephant, saying, no, the elephant's this and it's this. They're all correct from their different perspectives. So the story from my son is one day he had a bad day at school, and usually his days of schools are just, very, very good and positive. And so I was kind of troubled because my son has very good connections and good friends. And instead, one of his close friends kind of bullied him, and he was kind of shocked, and he said, I'm not going to be friends with this kid anymore. And it saddened me because they had been friends for a long time. And so I said to my son, Noah, well, can you see maybe why he was acting different? And he said, no, he's being a jerk. And so I said, well, do you remember that you often shared with me that his older sibling was kind of bullying him and taunting him? And so maybe the only way for him to understand that story is to forward the story to you to see it from a different perspective so that he can kind of collapse it. And so that's kind of deep for my son, but he understood that he was now being the receiving end for what his friend had been receiving from his older sibling. And so he could see and appreciate what his friend had been going through from his sibling situation. And so they made up the next week and they're still friends today.
So the
Oh, go ahead.
multiple perspectives. I love the seer, the seen, and the seeing. Annie, did I interrupt you?
No, I interrupted you, which I'm sorry for. A Zoom thing, it happens. Anyway, I was just going to add, in terms of the layered approach, maybe I'm answering it a different way, but I'd say for me, that's sort of what interests me is the evolution of our stories over time. And one person that came to mind who worked with us is a woman named Betsy, who first contacted me when her husband was terminally ill. He had a glioblastoma, which is a brain tumor. And they shared their story together then as an audio story that was aired on the radio. And then since he died, we've kept in touch, and she's twice shared a story for live events since then. And so it's been really fascinating seeing her evolution over time and how the story has changed and how it's, you know, integrating the loss of her husband. That was very therapeutic for them to tell it together, but then to see her step into this new role of single parent, widow, and see the story evolve over time. And so for me, I'm always thinking about sort of that evolution and that movement that I think is always happening, and our stories are always changing. And that layeredness I find really fascinating.
And the goal is when somebody gets stuck in a story in a particular period of time, and often that can happen with trauma, how do you help them get back into that sense that their story is evolving and that they are changing and growing and they are no longer who they were with, you know, new skills and abilities. Which leads me to a question that actually originally directed to Richard, but open it to anyone. As you were talking, Richard, about kids aren't hearing those stories anymore, a question came from Paula Weiss of, is there a difference between children hearing the personal stories, or can they get it through hearing, reading stories from literature or the traditional tales? And how does that fit into this idea of healing story? And
I think that that's a part of it. I think if you grow up in a culture which is steeped in story, where you're hearing stories that are folk tales and fairy tales, and I think that those can also inform our journey. So it's not just the personal, I think. I don't have a lot of data on that, but I suspect it's true.
And Juliet, I might ask you to speak to that as well, because you used some of the traditional tale frameworks to do the work. So that you're really that transition between the personal and the traditional, and how would you address that?
So thanks for that question. I wanted to actually talk about that. That what the myths and the fairy tales and the more traditional tales seem to do is to enable people to talk about traumatic experience without being re-traumatized, because they're reframed in these mythical characters, in these very sharply drawn characters and scenes and events. So just offhand, there have been so many people that have come into my practice suffering huge trauma. So I'm thinking of a group of women who were breast cancer patients and survivors, which I later became myself, not knowing at the time that I was going to learn a lot from these women. But teaching them the hero's journey it gave them power in this powerless situation where they were being talked to by doctors and by social workers, but not by peers. The one thing that they all said that had really been lacking was just hearing from other women a story that could encourage them and give them some kind of container for what they were going through. And I was then able to use that with that same kind of paradigm for myself when I faced it. And even now, with the depression, the waves of emotion that go through us in these long months of quarantine, I find that if I think of this as a story I'm living through, a mythic story, the story is my soul. everything that's possible for me in this life, my radiant essence. The journey that I'm taking through these months, through my life, with all the challenges, are like Michelangelo's, carving away at the stone to release the angel in the stone. It's to release this radiant spirit in us. So that's sort of how I see these big mythical stories that really reside in the right brain, not so much biography in the left brain, but that take us into this larger life that we all really, I think, who are attracted to story, want to be living. It gives us that container as soon as we create the structure around experience, we can't be fully traumatized by it anymore. And when we write it as characters, we're not putting ourselves, me, Julie, back in traumas of childhood or adulthood that disrupted my life and tore the pillars out of my identity. I'm part of a flow that's bigger than me and bigger than you, and it sort of directs me to this sort of gravitational field of, I don't know, belonging. I think that's the word that I use: homecoming, belonging, being part of something greater. My story is just the particulars, but there's a meta story that I'm living and sharing with other people.
A lot of you knew Sid Lieberman, who's a fabulous storyteller. And years ago, I brought Sid down to Orlando to work with writers at Disney. And he said something that I thought was profound. He said, he was talking about humor, that humor was seeing your life from the other side of the street. And I think this is about as a concept for me, is about self-distance, is that when we're enmeshed in our story, in the particulars of our story, we have very little perspective. There's some researchers that identified they call it the Solomon complex. People would come to Solomon for great wisdom, and he always had a perspective, and he could adjudicate and deal with all kinds of thorny issues and help people see their way through them. But his life was a mess, personally and as a leader. He was not able to see his own life with that same perspective. And so I think a lot of the journey, especially I'm thinking of Juliet in terms of being able to see our life mythically, is to get some distance from our own particulars of our life and see it in a bigger perspective, and not identify with it so much. So is actually to de-identify with the particulars of it, and to be able to look at it and go, oh, that's interesting, without being in it, but to be able to see it from the other side of the street. And I found that to be a useful metaphor.
The question from the chat, and we have just another minute or two, but that jumps out, it has to do with the times that we're living in. And Lynn Schweikert has asked, is there any way we can use some of these healing story templates that each of you has raised to help healing our divisiveness, our polity now in this time? So if any of you, Anne, jump in.
I have a story about that. So I think that the most vulnerable and personal stories are the most universal. And that when we tell stories that are coming from that deep, vulnerable place, we can identify with someone who might seem like our enemy when we first started out. So we did a series here, Maine, where I live, is the whitest state in the country. And we did a series on asylum seeking women, the stories of women asylum seekers here in Maine who are almost entirely from Central Africa, although also some from Syria. So we had a number of women of color telling stories of torture and fleeing, and stories that weren't part of the daily lived experience of a lot of white Mainers. And we had a survey for our listeners, and 93% of listeners said, when we said, could you, even though this woman was very different from you, could you identify with her? And 93% said, yes, I could identify with her. And what I learned from that is that when someone is speaking from their real vulnerability, we can connect with them across huge difference. So right now we're so divided. We don't trust each other. We fear each other. And I think really courageously vulnerable stories is a way to begin to connect.
Well, does anyone want to add on to that? It's hard to follow that. I guess my bringing it home would just say we are all wounded listeners in need of a healing tale, and we all have the potential to be healing tellers to help those who are seeking it. So each of you, I can't thank you enough for bringing your rich experience and wisdom and knowledge. I think this could be a course that could go for months. For listeners here, I know each of the people here is easily Googleable and to find rich resources that they offer on their websites, in their talks, in their books. And I encourage you to track them down to learn more. But thank you for being with us today. And thank you again for Nest for making this possible, and Jim Brule for being our great supporter. Thanks for coming, everybody.